Hello, and welcome to the Illinois Academy of Criminology's webinar on the measurement of violent crime in the U.S. I'm Jona Goldschmidt, president of the Academy. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan 501c3 organization that conducts educational programs on cutting-edge criminal justice issues. We've been doing so since our founding in 1950 at the University of Chicago. Visit our website at illacad.org. That's ILLACAD.org to learn more about our organization and access recordings of our past programs. Today, we have a distinguished speaker, Ernesto Lopez, from the Council on Criminal Justice, who will discuss the various methods of measuring violent crime in the U.S. Ernesto joined the council after serving as a research consultant, analyzing crime trends for the council and its National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice. During his time at the council, Ernesto has authored more than a dozen reports on crime trends in large U.S. cities and served as research staff for the Violent Crime Working Group of the council, the task force on long sentences of the council, and the crime trends working group. Ernesto regularly presents to policy groups, including the White House Domestic Policy Council, the National Governors Association, the National Criminal Justice Association, and the Black Mayors Coalition on Crime. He previously worked for the Veterans Administration, and he's also a U.S. Army veteran who was deployed to Iraq in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Ernesto has a Bachelor of Political Science from Cal State Fullerton, a Master's of Public Administration from the University of Missouri, St. Louis, where he's also currently a doctoral candidate in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Missouri. So Ernesto, welcome and take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation to share some of my expertise on crime data. As Jonah mentioned, I'll be going over some of the major sources of of where we get violent crime data in the United States. It's going to be a quick overview of some of these sources, and then I'll walk through some of the tools that are most accessible to the public. But before I do that, I briefly want to mention a little bit about the Council on Criminal Justice. So the Council on Criminal Justice is a two-part organization. We are a think tank and an invitational membership organization. And really what we focus on is building consensus for the policy challenges and how to address those challenges in the criminal justice space. If you'd like to know more about the council, I encourage you to take a look at our website, counciloncj.org. And I'll have some of that information at the very end, but just a little bit about our organization. So when we look at violent crime data, there are really several main sources that I'm going to be focusing on today. And that will primarily be law enforcement data and the National Crime Victimization Survey, or the NCVS. Another major source of data that I'm not really going to get into today are various public health sources, mostly maintained by the CDC. And I'll briefly mention that the collection of the public health data does not solely rely on law enforcement information or survey victimization, but typically comes from death certificates that are available at the county level and then aggregated up nationally. Also mention briefly that there's different reasons why you would use these different sources. We're not going to get into all that today, but the main point to highlight the different sources is just to appreciate the variety of information out there and that each source has some advantages and disadvantages. And really what we're going to focus on is the law enforcement data and the NCVS today, but happy to answer other questions where appropriate. outside of these main sources, we also have other sources, right? There's the UN, the World Bank, and other international organizations for international crime data or violent crime data. Other surveys that ask about victimization, self-report offending. These are really important, particularly if we want to understand like how juveniles offend. And again, this is all this can all also include violent crime. So if youth are engaging in violence at a higher rate, but that's not getting reported, and the people that they're victimizing aren't captured in the NCVS, right? This victimization survey. It's another way to measure what's going on in with violent crime throughout the country. There's open source data. One that's been very popular the last several years is the Gun Violence Archive. This generally uses media sources, but they also incorporate law enforcement data to capture all sorts of gun violence in the country. And media, really, when you look at major media outlets, they will also track violent crime, and even places that like the LA Times, for instance, will track homicides for Los Angeles. So there's all sorts of sources that you can get crime data from. And the last one I'll mention are really these niche short sources, excuse me. So like Department of Defense may have something like victimization on military bases. Businesses will collect their own data on assaults that occur on their premises. And I'll just mention briefly that as sort of obscure as that may be, that actually became really important in the conversation a few years ago about shoplifting and right, is crime going out of control? And something that the business industry was referencing was their own data that people are getting assaulted in stores, their employees are at risk. So, and it's worth noting that some of the research I did looked at victimization using police data that occurred in a store and didn't really match that narrative. So I think that's something when we want to look at crime data, particularly with violence, it's important to appreciate that there are different sources, but we're only going to focus on the law enforcement and the NCBS today. So turning to the law enforcement data, there's three really buckets you can put them in, and they do go into sequential order for the most part. Most law enforcement data is generated at the local law enforcement agency level. Certainly, there's state agencies, but the overall majority are going to be local law enforcement. And then what happens is that those local law enforcement agencies will send the data to a state agency. So yeah, so there's local law enforcement agencies, and then those agencies will send it to the state agency where the state will conduct some basic data quality assurance and then send it off to the FBI. And you can access data at all three levels. You can access the data from individual agency websites, from the state level UCR program, and then the national UCR program, which is the Uniform Crime Reports, if I didn't mention that already. It's also worth noting that the data you get from these three sources, while eventually ending essentially in the same place at the FBI through the UCR program, have different features. What's really important to know, really at that individual agency level, is you can get where the incident happened using sort of geocoded data. What, like a pin, if you had a map of a city and you dropped a pin where crimes would be, that's something that's a unique feature. In a place like Chicago and a lot of other major cities, you can break out crime by different districts, or in Chicago's case, wards. So that's other features you get when you're looking at law enforcement data um, from these different agencies at different levels. There's a whole bunch of more information we can talk about when it comes to the local law enforcement level. There's some differences with states, but most of this conversation is going to focus really on what the FBI puts out. And what I want to do is walk through two of the major components of the Uniform Crime Reports, or the UCR. The first is the SRS, which is the Summary Reporting System. Most people refer to that as the UCR, but the UCR is a broader range of collections, right, which include NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, but it also includes like LEOKIA data, so that's data on law enforcement officers who are assaulted and killed. There's some use of force collections, I know, hate crime statistics, law enforcement employment. There's probably one or two more other collections within the UCR, but colloquially, when we say the UCR, generally we're talking about the SRS. So I'm going to go through quickly about some of the key differences between these two collections. The first is the type of data. Under the SRS, it's technically monthly aggregate data. You can get it's generally reported by year. We think of it reported by year, but it's available by the month. I'll highlight some of those differences a little bit later on when I walk you through the tools. But what's really important with NIBRS is its incident level data. So you can do an analysis of what time do robberies happen, right? Do they happen more in the morning, right before people are going to work, later in the evening, what day they happen? Burglaries are a good example of that. What time you could examine what time do residential burglaries occur? So that incident level. So if you imagine a spreadsheet, every row in that spreadsheet is an incident. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and I'll highlight that in a moment. But that's really the big difference versus just an aggregate count of this is how many robberies happened, this is how many burglaries happened. And related to that, the SRS has a limited number of offenses, what we call the Part 1 offenses, as I have listed here. Murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, and arson was added later. And arson's one that's not always reported as frequently. There's also these things we call Part 2 offenses, which are related to arrests. So those are only incidents that will be captured by arrest. And then NIBRS, that we call as Group A offenses, and they are these Part 1 offenses plus other ones such as simple assault, drug violations, fraud. There's over 70, and the FBI will periodically add more offenses. And then there's these Group B offenses, which could be like status offenses unique to juveniles, arrests. So there are a whole other group of offenses. So there's a lot more covered in the NIBRS data than there is in the SRS. One important distinction between the SRS and NIBRS is the hierarchy rule. And it's important to keep in mind, as you can probably see here on the chart, that the SRS is a much older system than NIBRS. And because of that, the technology available was more limited, and it was hard to keep track of all these incidents and make sure it's accurate. So the SRS follows the hierarchy rule, and that's only the most serious offense counts. So if there's a robbery and a homicide, only the homicide counts. That doesn't exist under NIBRS. If there's if there's a home burglary that occurs with a rape and it occurs with a homicide, those three offenses co-occurring, all three of those offenses are counted. It's also worth considering that when the FBI was requiring agencies to start reporting with NIBRS, that was some of the pushback that was presented to the FBI from law enforcement agencies, that it's going to make their crime look like it's gone up. But when the FBI has done analyses throughout time, it depends on the offense, but some violent crimes could increase about 3 to 5%. It's also, and one thing that both the FBI can do, I don't believe they do it in their most recent reporting, but local agencies can certainly do this if they feel that NIBRS is inflating the counts, is they can adjust their data to be consistent with the hierarchy rule. So an agency can say, here's what the data look like under NIBRS, and if we were to adjust the data to be consistent with the hierarchy rule, to have more of a comparative, time trend, this is what it would look like. So that's something that agencies can do to sort of remedy that concern. As I mentioned, there's a lot more detail in the in NIBRS compared to the SRS. While it's not technically the SRS, murder is an exception. There's something called the Supplemental Homicide Reports, or SHR. That is similar to a NIBRS format. Um, Not exactly, but very close to it. Only for homicide. So, and not as many agencies will provide that data. And as the FBI has transitioned to NIBRS, the supplementary homicide reports are no longer really used, at least for more recent years. Historically, if you want older data, yes, but not as much. The amount of data you can get from neighbors isn't just more offenses, but about things like the victim offender relationship, the value of stolen goods. So the shoplifting analysis I did, we talked about, there's that. You can get the numbers. We did an analysis on carjacking where we were able to look at the injuries of the victims, if a gun was used or not. So there's a lot more information. It's a lot richer of a source to get to inform the crime data or crime statistics and to inform public policy. It goes without saying with all this more detail, it's more complex. It's harder to report, it's harder to collect, it's more resource intensive. There's a lot more behind the scenes that's required with NIBRs. There's a lot more room for error because there's more information. There's just a ton out there available. And I'll show just a quick image. It's not going to be the clearest, but this is what the FBI has, or I believe BGS has. Again, not the clearest. There's no quiz on all these factors here. But if and this is actually spread over two PowerPoints that the BGS had. If you just look at these rows, these are just little data elements in NIBRs. So there's a lot in NIBRs. That's the main idea here. There's a lot more NIBRs than there is in the SRS. Again, not expecting everyone to read all this. So it's more complex. And then lastly, just cover the adoption. That the SRS was a system that officially began in 1930. There were changes, through the years. Typically, when we compare long-term historical trends, generally don't go back pre-1960 because there's a weighting method the FBI does. And I'll talk maybe about that a little bit. But the way the FBI estimated data at a national level was quite a bit different when you're going really far back in the series. NIBRS was officially adopted in 2021 nationally. Going back to the early 90s, there were agencies that were reporting NIBRS, but not nearly any national coverage. And we're still struggling with some national coverage. As you can see in this chart I have going from 2017 just to 2022, when there was a big shift of changing to NIBRS. You can see that it also varies by city size. That's the basics of the SRS and NIBRS. So where we're going to turn to now is the National Crime Victimization Survey, commonly known as the NCVS. And this is a survey that was developed by the Bureau of Justice Statistics and conducted annually by the Census Bureau, and it serves as the primary national source of criminal victimization. It was first fielded in 1973 and underwent a major redesign in 1993. I believe the original version was the NCS, the National Crime, or NBS, National Crime Victimization, NCS, National Crime Survey. That was it. So you can technically compare those two. The way the way BJS fielded the survey was staggered, so you can get a sense of where the differences were. And BJS is always redesigning and improving the survey, and they're always clear about that methodology, which is a great value to the field. The survey currently collects information from approximately 240,000 people in 150 U.S. households that are representative of the nation's demographics. Participants limited to those 12 and above are interviewed about their experiences with criminal victimization, including frequency, types, and impacts. It's important to note, though, that if people who are in households, businesses, there's not everybody gets captured in the survey. Um, it does a pretty good job of capturing most of the population, but if you were to look at something like, I know the focus is violent crime, so it's not that of this conversation, so it's not that big of an issue in this context, but something like resident commercial burglary is not captured. And so it covers non-fatal personal crimes, assault, robbery, sexual assault, and household property crimes, as well if it's reported to law enforcement or not. I'm not going to spend as much time on this table because we really went through the UCR, and it's really just a summary of a lot of what I mentioned. Again, household survey of 12 and above with the NCBS versus the UCR, which is all law enforcement agencies. Importantly, it's victimization that may or may not be reported to law enforcement compared to the UCR is only crimes known to law enforcement. The types of offenses are similar to the SRS, the summary reporting system, but excludes homicide because it is a survey and we don't capture that, and businesses, as mentioned. And then the publications are annual summarized NCVS data presented in the Criminal Victimization Report published by BJS. And the UCR is a little bit more complicated now as they've moved to more consistent monthly reporting. And when I go through the data tools, that'll be clearer. But there is still the big annual report, crime in the United States, that the FBI puts out. Um, yeah. And so when we look at these trends, because you can compare the annual rates of violent crime, and in this case, we're just looking at serious violent crime, excluding homicide because the UCR doesn't include homicide. We can get a sense of does the NCBS and the UCR tell the same story? And what we did, this is a report that I worked on with Janet Lawrenson from the University of Missouri St. Louis. And we looked at the reported to police, the UCR rate, the reported and unreported to police, the NCBS rate. So that's that darker line, and the reported to police rate from the NCBS. What you generally expect is that this teal and kind of light purple line should be generally telling the same story. And roughly around 2000, it generally does. There's some deviations. Notably in around 2020, 2021, there's some pretty large recent deviations, right? Some pretty big gaps and differences that emerge. Um, and then when you look at the total using the NCVS of reported and unreported to police, you see this gap. So this the gap between this darker line, the reported and unreported, is essentially the crime rate that is unreported to police. That's in essence what that is. But when we think of the NCVS, especially when we were looking at their annual report, it's a little more complicated than that. And in general, which shows in this trend really from the late 90s to essentially the present day, there's some difference. They generally show the same story, the same trends. They generally move together. However, if there's a period of rapid crime change, they may differ quite a bit. And what we looked at was this period from 2018 to 2022, which was the most recent available data by interview year. So, or incident year, excuse me. So when individuals are surveyed, they're asked, the last 6 months, has this happened to you and how many times? And when BGS puts out the report, it is, if you see a number of incidents in 2022, those are not necessarily the number of incidents that occurred in 2022. It's that's the interview, when the interview occurred. So someone could be interviewed in February and they could be reporting a crime that happened in October. And the way it will look on paper is, February of that year is when that crime reported. It's when you go back and you look at the actual raw data, you can make these adjustments. Um, the big takeaway here, it's a pretty complicated graph, but the big takeaway here is once you adjust for that timing difference and you adjust for police reported offenses, that it that the NCBS generally does tell a similar story to the UCR. There are some clear differences, and it looks like from the most recent years that those differences could be a little larger and something we have to keep looking at. But generally, they tell the same story. I think in maybe a year or two, once we have more data, we'll know if there is a bigger systemic problem or differences between the NCBS and UCR. So I'm going to walk through the two common tools, but I'll pause right here for if there are any questions before, or actually while I'm bringing this up, for any questions on what I've talked about thus far.
Yes, Ernesto, are you saying that the FBI is transitioning to NIBRS and abandoning the UCR?
So that officially, in big air quotes, that officially occurred in 2021. However, agencies, particularly large US agencies, weren't making that transition yet. And so the FBI went back and they've accepted the summary reporting system. So even if an agency didn't transition to NIBRS, they can still provide that monthly count number or at an annual level. Um, I believe they are still taking the SRS data, um, but the number of agencies reporting it are a lot smaller. Most agencies now, I think it's coming up to over 80%, are reporting with NIBRS. Um, so that's not as much of an issue as it was before. But when you're comparing crime data, typically, you nationally from the FBI, you want to be cautious about using 2021 because 2021 was during that transition, and the FBI even states like that it's not comparable to other years.
And one other question. You showed us the chart with the NIBRS form that has to be filled out by every
hmm
agency. Can you give us a rough estimate of how many variables are in the reporting form that each agency is required to fill out for each crime?
I would say I don't have a clear answer to that, but the number would vary based off the crime. So if there's only one offender or reported offender, that's going to vary because you're going to still get the sex, age, race, ethnicity of that offender, the relationship between that offender and the victim. Now, if there's two offenders, you're going to get that same information over again. So if you think if someone was assaulted by three people, and you could have a situation where you have one victim who was assaulted by three people, and you're going to need to know, or which should be in NIBRS is the ages of all three of those people, the race of those three people, the sex of those three people, and the relationship of those three people. So maybe it was like someone's brother, and then a friend, and then a stranger, and weapons used. Maybe there was different crimes those offenders committed. One could be a simple assault and an aggravated assault and a sexual assault. So the number of variables grows depending on the crime. And the same thing it goes with if there's no property information whatsoever, then that whole element isn't involved. Or if it's, what's common with a lot of property crimes is you don't have the offender information. Oftentimes, if someone steals something from you, even something like a vehicle, you have no idea who did it. So that information doesn't get filled. So it really varies based off the offense, and it raises a lot of questions as far as the accuracy when you have a lot more of these data elements that are required by NIBRS. Like I said, if it's an incident where there's four or five people involved, the accuracy of those incidents or the accuracy of those characteristics, I think, is a little more questionable. There's some research that looks at that, but it's a little dated. So I'd be curious to see how accurate that information is now as more agencies have adopted NIBRS.
Thank you. One other question
Sure.
before you go on. Uh, the violent crime trend seems to be going down in the big cities. Is there the same pattern or trend in smaller cities like Albuquerque or Indianapolis or Milwaukee?
Yeah, I think I would still classify those as big cities. Yeah, they're tend to be captured in. So what we do at the council is we track crime trends, and every 6 months, basically, we put out a report. Um, and our rough count, or excuse me, our rough cutoff is about 200,000 people population. We do find generally these cities have been following the same trends when it comes to violent crime. Certainly some variation. Um, there's some evidence that rural areas, so you're thinking much smaller, like non-urban areas, are following a similar trend, though maybe not seeing as big of a decline in violence. Uh, so I think it's something we've seen consistently. It's also worth noting that the timing of these declines haven't really been consistent. Something we found in our own research, not really related to city size, but by homicide levels. Cities that had the highest homicide rates historically, so places like St. Louis, Detroit, Baltimore, these sorts of cities, um, tend to have seen bigger declines post 2020 quicker. So many of these jurisdictions saw really large increases in homicide. Baltimore actually didn't see an increase, but they're seeing a decline from 2019 to 2020. Um, but many of these traditionally high homicide cities across like many large US cities in the US saw increases in homicide and are seeing declines, but these historically high homicide cities have seen larger declines quicker. Um, and so that's something that we've noticed in our data that we've tracked with violent crime and particularly with homicide. Okay.
Let me ask you one more question
Sure.
before you go on. Is the number of police officers on the street uh, related to the incidence of violent crime? In other words, can violent crime be reduced by having more officers on the street?
The simple answer, I would say, is yes, based off uh, research that's been done. But I think it's important to caveat that one of the landmark studies that have looked at that question, I would say is, I want to say is published in 98. And there's been other studies that have looked at it. But I think the general consensus is a yes, but with an asterisk. And that asterisk is it's more important what police do, right? And I think now with increases in police technology augmenting law enforcement, it's not as clear of an equation. I think we have to take a closer look at that question as law enforcement has changed, and even as street crime has changed as well. And something we noted in our last crime trends report is the shifting of victimization. That robberies aren't happening at the rate they used to. And what does victimization look like now? And how is this traditional policing, address these concerns? And so there's things like, I know shot spotter technologies or other detection systems, license plate readers, facial recognition, real-time crime centers, all these innovations that have occurred in law enforcement. So I think that general, yes, more police equals less crime is true, but I don't think it's as necessary anymore. And even the availability of, like I talked about with the law enforcement data, the ability for police to be smarter in their crime prevention, of being able to sort of anticipate where crimes can happen and narrow um, these narrow down to very specific areas and cities, that was a technology that was available only to the largest cities with the largest budgets. But now, mid-sized cities have that technology. So I think it's a really good question about that relationship between law enforcement and violent crime. And does that relationship still hold the same way it did even 5 or 10 years ago? All right. So this is the Crime Data Explorer from the FBI. Um, I'll just note that this uh, sort of banner up here uh, highlights that the FBI is going to be publishing their annual report. I believe it's supposed to be, yeah, May. Um, yeah, and so that's something that's a new thing. So the FBI typically would put out their report around September, but they've pushed it earlier. And there's a lot to walk through here. I'm not going to go through everything. I'm just going to highlight some really key features, and then where you can find more data. Um, but this actually isn't even I'll just show you the regular homepage. So this is the regular homepage to this. I don't really use this side that much. I usually just go to this part right here. This is the main aspect or main feature. And let me show you homicides quickly. Um, and okay, I'm trying to get too advanced here, but the FBI, in as good intentioned as it is that they are providing monthly data, you have to be really careful with it. So, um, what we know, and this is true, is that many crimes, particularly violent crimes, spike in the summer. They do not spike at the end of the year. But if you look at what the FBI has here in December 2024, you see the spike in homicide. That's this middle line here. And you see some little variation, and then you see a spike in 2023. And I don't know, maybe people are drinking a lot around the holidays, and which is probably true. But the reason why you see these spikes at the 12-month period or in December is because that's when agencies are submitting their data, right? They are submitting annual data and it's marked as December submissions, and it's all their counts that are being tallied for the year reflecting in this monthly pattern. So you have to be very careful when using this tool, um, that the monthly data here are probably not the best to use because it's when agencies are reporting it. So, this is typically isn't a problem, and it hasn't really been a problem for most crime data because it's usually annual, and then when the annual report comes out, it all gets fixed and adjusted. Or if you download the raw data underneath, which is a huge file and it's a lot of work, I'm not going to walk through that today. You can adjust for that. But that's a major caution when using some of these online tools. You have to be aware of the data and the caveats that come with it. Um, and let me show you a neighbor's offense, then you can get a sense. So let's do a simple, since we're talking about violent crime. Let's look, see if it's under here. It should be simple assaults. So if we look at simple assaults, okay. Um, NIBRS is a little bit different because a lot of agencies are submitting that monthly, so you're not seeing this huge variation by month. Um, but and then you also can see, I guess I'll walk through this real quick, that this darker line is the population covered, which is, I said, it's probably about over 80% now with NIBRS, and you can see that here. It drops off because that's for this year, that's it, that's agencies reporting their data like within the last few months. That's a little bit different. We're not worried so much about this right now. And then here in the blue middle line, you see the offenses and they have a clearance rate. Let me pull the timeline back a bit. And if you looked at this, you would see like, wow, we've got really violent with simple assault. That's that blue line here. And it jumps up. So it really jumps up around 2017, because in 2016 is when the FBI announced they were going to be transitioning to NIBRS starting in 2021. So when there's that announcement, more agencies went to NIBRS, and you see this jump. Um, and then just reporting that data, and then you see that another one in sort of 2021. Part of it will reflect actual crime trends changing, but if you looked at this again, not knowing that information, you may think we just started pushing and smacking people around in 2017 for no reason. Um, so that's something to be aware of. And then when you go back even further, it gets even harder to tell. But this is just agencies reporting to NIBRS. And then when you look at a non-NIBRS offense, you see that seasonality at the end of the year become really pronounced. So that's something you should be aware of. Um, Again, there's so much in this tool. There's a lot of great information to break down the characteristics. So if you change the crime type, you get different characteristics of the offense. And so, I said, I'm not going to walk through every step here. because there's just so much there and you got to look around. But one thing I will highlight, I guess there'll be two pieces I'll highlight. One quickly will be these special reports that the FBI has been putting out because it's something they haven't traditionally done. A lot of it's violence, and it's the FBI is sort of summarizing a lot of these really interesting crime types for you. So I recommend taking a look there. And again, it's this Data Explorer Crime Data Special Reports. So the big one I want to go through a little bit more is these documents and downloads. The reason why is because, I've talked to many reporters, other people in the community, and they are like, where do I find this FBI data? Right? I want to know how many assaults were there in the state of Chicago in 2022, or aggravated assaults, or how many arrests, or just other information, and they can't find it. It's because it's a little tricky. You have to go down to the crime in the US annual reports, select the year. And then once you select the year, then you have to select what it is you want to download. And if you're someone who doesn't really know crime data, you're not even going to know where to start. But because you're listening to this webinar, the crime in the US estimations is a good place to start, as well as the resource pages. So those are really good places to start. But there's a lot of information. We can't cover all that today, but I think it's for people who are looking for more digestible crime, um, or if you download this file, it's going to give you basically a table of contents of what you're looking for. This is where you would go. I'll also note, if you notice, it doesn't go back pre-2020, because if you want any other data, it's on a different website that the FBI has. And that's, if you just search crime in the US 2019, it'll take you to that website. It's a challenge. So the FBI has improved their data and their accessibility, but I think, and it's promising to see that they're continuing to improve it. But I would say it's still a work in progress. And then there's some more detailed files on the very bottom. Um, that download these other tables, you have to have some really advanced programming skills to get. But the big one, I think, is really these crime in the US annual reports. Um, so I don't want to go too much more through this because it would just be a little repetitive and too much in the weeds. Um, a much easier tool to use. I just want to make sure that I'm going to be sharing the same screen, the right screen. There we go. Okay. Um, for some reason it didn't take me to where I was supposed to. Okay, let me bring that up real quick. The data analysis tools. So BGS has a ton of data tools. I'll just mention too, they do have their own NCBS tool called Learcat. Um, I don't use it that often. It's a good tool, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes there. So let me find the NCBS. Here we go. All right, the N-dash tool. Okay. So the N-dash tool is a lot more user friendly, I think, because at the FBI's website, you can get it by specific agency, but you don't have that issue with the NCBS because it's only available essentially at a national level. There's ways you can break it up, but you can't get, what victimization was like in California, or Dallas, Texas, or something like that. It's generally going to be national level. And there's a lot of information. It walks you through step by step, but I'll just show real quick. When I tend to use it, I tend to use the custom graphics. It's not particularly complicated. So if you wanted to look at a multi-year trend by characteristic, right? Let's look at personal. It's worth noting too that the property crime, when you look at a rate, it's not by individual, it's households. So if we look at personal crimes, we can look at victimization age, and you can see the rate of violent victimizations by age. And it talks you through. There's some data notes. You can download the data, which I think is on the bottom somewhere. Yeah, you can download the tables, images. You can even filter this down even further. So if you go by sex and age, right? And then you get males, the rate of victimization by age. They should have, oh, there you go. The female, right? So there's a lot. that you can do, and then you can even break it out. So if you wanted to look at simple assaults by uh, by age and sex, you can do that. There's a and you just could filter through all sorts of characteristics. Um, another one. So if you were on to like the let's do population size, maybe not victimization sex, but like reported to police or not for robberies, right? So this would be, did they report to police? Yes, they did. And you get that rate. Um, and this is by population size. So there's a lot in here with the NCVS that you can do. I find it more user friendly. The last thing I'll mention here is their terms and definitions is really helpful. If you're unsure of how they calculate something, they spell it out here. Um, and I'll just note that with the Council on Criminal Justice, we had a violent crime, excuse me, our crime trends working group made the recommendation that the FBI should continue collecting crime data the way they do, but reporting of it should be shifted to BGS because as a statistical agency, they have the personnel, the expertise, the infrastructure to really communicate statistics in a more digestible way, and they have a ton of tools available. So I'll just briefly note that was something that we released as a policy recommendation from our crime trends working group. So that's all that I was going to go through with these websites. If there's a specific question, I can try to show that here, but if not, I'm happy to answer any other questions.
I've got one final question. In 2014, we had the Michael Brown shooting and the riots in Ferguson. You're right in your neighborhood there.
Mhm.
In 2022, I believe it was, we had the George Floyd uh, demonstrations and disruptions all over the country. Um, do these and have these affected the frequency of crime based on the theory that there was a loss of public trust of the police during those times?
So I think, yeah, so the Michael Brown did happen in 2014. George Floyd was the end of May in 2020. And I think there's more evidence to that for the George Floyd question than the Mike Brown question. There's been not as much research for Michael Brown's death and the relationship there. Limited evidence that it may have at all. But I would say my short answer to Michael Brown is a no, because there's not nearly as much evidence. And it identifying that, right? The one of the arguments, I mean, it becomes right, this whole Ferguson effect argument. There's different versions of the Ferguson effect, if it's police pulling back, right? Or is it a drop in like police legitimacy and that component of it. So I think there's something that we have to be able to untangle that we really can't. Yeah. And so I think that's a little more difficult for the Mike Brown incident. And I may have mentioned it earlier, but when it comes to understanding crime, especially the last, 10 years or so, and even maybe a little less, we're at a better advantage to understanding the causes of what causes shifts in crime trends because we have more data now. And I think when we look at something like the murder of George Floyd, we can also look at activity, how activity changed with the pandemic. But that level of cell phone data, and again, the police data is a lot more detailed now than it was even a few years ago, or about a decade or a dozen years ago. I think what complicates. So let me backtrack a small bit. So the Michael Brown, I would say, is a no, just because the evidence doesn't really support it. I think the George Floyd is a maybe, leaning towards a yes. Um, and it's really tough because again, we're unable to capture, like we're not able to really survey people monthly about their changes to police legitimacy and reporting crime and all that aspect is not really captured. But it's a very robust finding in the research that the summer of 2020 was significantly higher than the early part of 2020. Now, the early part of 2020 was already trending upward a bit, but some of the research suggests that 2020 was a big jump beyond seasonal changes. So I think that's something that we need to continue to look at, and that research has slowed down a lot. But it's a real tough to answer that because there's so much that occurs in 2020. Um, with COVID-19, and we try to measure it, but I think there's a bit more evidence that the George Floyd could have had a bigger effect. Just because even you look at the protests, the response, the social response was a lot stronger of something, of a murder that happens on video. So I think there's better support for that, but I still would be cautious to put a full yes onto it.
Okay, one of our board members has asked, assuming there's 18,000 police agencies, local, county, state, and so forth, is there an issue with the fact that these smaller departments don't have the staff to collect all the data and fill out all those forms with the NIBRS?
Yes. So when you look at the agencies that reported with neighbors, it's a little odd story. So the first agencies that really adopted neighbors were small agencies because there were grants from the federal government that give these agencies that capacity to adopt neighbors before 2016. So before they made that, the FBI made the big push um, to have these agencies adopt. So there was grants available mostly to small agencies. So a lot of the agencies that have been reporting NIBRs for 20 years tend to be smaller. Um, and in some ways, it's a little easier because if you're training, staff of five versus a staff of 500, there's a little less capacity. Now, with that said, these larger agencies, the last few years, places like Los Angeles, New York City, were some of the later adopters of NIBRs because it's so expensive to put these systems on and to train people and to update all the systems. So now that those agencies are generally on board, we're still seeing that there is that gap within some of those remaining small NIBRS agencies. But there are, free what they call RMS records management systems that are available in many states. So generally, that states can actually require their local jurisdictions to report NIBRs. I don't believe many do. Um, it certainly is not required from the federal government, and there's some federalism questions if that can be required. So I think yes, it is a general problem, but I don't think it's as large as you would expect because of the early adopters for NIBRs. Um, but and then also, if we want to look at national pictures of crimes, it shouldn't really have an effect because those agencies aren't contributing that much to the national picture.
We've got one other question. What are the trends on drug-related violent crime, specifically to drug use on the crime side, not the overdose side? And then the business of drugs, street interactions, turf battles, and system level drug crime. Uh, can you tell us anything about drug related crime versus non-drug
Yeah.
related crime?
So I like the distinction about the overdoses because that's typically how we measure drug market activity in the research. There's some, especially at more of a local level, I think generally it's available at the county. We track drug crimes at the council in our crime trends reports. What we found generally is that they dropped significantly at the onset of the pandemic, right, in 2020. They remain low. If I recall correctly, there's been a little uptick, but they're still significantly lower. The big caveat to that is most of those drug crimes are going to be a result of law enforcement activity, right, and arrests. So it's not so much someone calling the police and reporting that someone's using drugs. That does occur, but for the most part, these offenses are a result, the way that's tracked is these offenses are the result of police engaging in an arrest, making an arrest that also for some other offense that tends to be that will then they'll then discover drugs are involved. So that is something we want to understand these trends, make it difficult to understand what's really occurring there because there's so much overlap with arrests and law enforcement activity. Um, that's something we note in our reports. So I think I still think that the drug overdoses are probably the best indicator we have. Aside from what I mentioned about surveys, you're not going to get really local estimates, but when you look at the usage, the self-report use, particularly I know with like younger people, there tends to be less. I know that's true with like alcohol consumption and I know drug use. So I think that's something that we need to take a closer look at is how have these drug market areas have changed, and also taking a closer look at the survey data because while you can't get that geographic picture, you can get a national picture with a national based survey, and get different offending patterns and stuff there. So I think that's important to consider. I think the other part of the question was related to the drug system markets, right? Um, yeah, it's like, I think the way that that research tends to be limited, with drug markets, but also it's important to know with some of these really specific, once you really start moving outside these part one crimes, it's not generally available in a lot of the crime data that we use to understand crime trends. So a lot of these are going to be enforcement operations from like, the DEA or other um, really these niche data sources that we don't incorporate really well into our data. And that was another recommendation of our crime trends working group is to really move beyond these traditionally part one crimes to look at other sorts of crimes that are related to harm. So it's something we don't measure that well, but I think the overall trend is that there's likely a reduction in drug offending, but we certainly miss a lot of it as far as like what gets trafficked into the country. That's just something that is not in the typical crime collection, but certainly something that should be integrated into when we understand crime.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ernesto. On behalf of the Illinois Academy of Criminology, we really appreciate your expertise. And thanks again, and we hope to have you again soon with an update.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.